He was a poor farmer living in silence and obscurity. Until one day something that shouldn't exist sprouted in his dying soil. Just 1 week later, he left everything behind and disappeared. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. Elijah Brooks had never imagined his life would be anything other than exactly what it was. Every morning before the first trace of dawn, he rose from his narrow bed, pushed his feet into worn boots, and stepped outside into the chilled silence of the open plains. His farm sat alone on the outskirts of Silver Creek, a small town that seemed to have been forgotten by maps and time alike. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, a flat canvas of dusty gold that felt eternal, unchanging, and yet always threatening to slip away beneath his feet. The sky was usually streaked with colors only a man who woke before the sun could see, shades that existed for mere minutes before the day burned them into a flat sheet of blue. Elijah always paused to witness them, not because he was sentimental by nature, but because these dawns were proof that his world still turned, that his work still mattered. His farm was not much to look at. The house, built by his grandfather's hands long before he was born, had once been painted white, but the sun and wind had gnawed at its wood for decades until the walls looked like parchment abandoned in the desert. The barn sagged to one side, held upright by Elijah's careful reinforcement and stubborn refusal to let anything on this land surrender. The fields, his pride, his responsibility, had suffered through long summers without a drop of mercy from the clouds. The earth cracked open like the skin of a parched throat. Rows of corn stood thin and brittle, their stalks whispering protests each time the wind passed through them. He tended to each row anyway, unwilling to give up on what had given his family purpose across generations. Silver Creek was not a place people came to by accident. It was the kind of town where the names on mailboxes had been the same for 50 years, and where the only sign of modern life was the faded neon sign on the diner that flickered unpredictably each evening, trying to stay alive like the rest of the town. People there knew everything about each other, or believed they did. Conversations were slow, built on routines rather than new discoveries. Outsiders were rare, and as a result, always remembered. Elijah wasn't an outsider, though he sometimes felt like one. He was known and respected for his constant, quiet willingness to help. A fence fixed here, a few vegetables left on a doorstep there, task completed without fanfare or expectation. If someone brought up his kindness, he would brush it aside as simply the right thing to do. He did not have a wife or children, and most folks considered this both a tragedy and a blessing, depending on the angle they chose to see. Some whispered he'd once loved someone who left. Others believed he had never tried. Elijah himself didn't spend much time pondering it. He found his fulfillment in the earth beneath his boots, in chores that left his muscles aching yet alive, in the feeling that he had earned every breath he took. But in the quiet moments, when twilight settled inside the house, like a shadow refusing to leave, loneliness sometimes crept in beside him. He would swallow it down, reminding himself that his family had given him the greatest gift possible, a home and land that depended upon him. The drought had arrived slowly at first, then settled deeply into the land like a curse. Each year seemed drier than the last. Wells ran shallow, crops withered, hope thinned. Elijah tried everything he knew to keep his soil breathing. He built makeshift irrigation lines, stored every precious drop of rainwater, even whispered encouragements to the crops as though they were old friends in need of comfort. His father had once told him that the land listened, that it remembered kindness in ways humans often did not. Elijah clung to that belief the way others clung to faith itself. Still, his efforts weren't enough. He had begun to fall behind on payments to the bank. Letters came in crisp white envelopes that held threats disguised in polite language, telling him the farm might soon belong to someone else. He didn't throw them away. He tucked them into a drawer, unable to face them, yet unable to discard them. They waited there like vultures that knew their meal would eventually stop moving. Despite it all, Elijah woke each day determined. It was not in his nature to surrender. His family wouldn't have forgiven it. His father used to stand with his boots planted deep in the soil and say that land was more than dirt. It was a promise made by every hand that had turned it before. Elijah believed that promise was his to honor. On a typical evening, Once the sun dipped behind the dust-choked horizon, Elijah would sit in the old rocking chair outside his home. The wood creaked softly beneath him, as though speaking its own language of age and endurance. Sometimes he would hum a tune his mother used to sing, or watch the stars battle their way through the haze. The wind would carry the scent of dry grass and warm stone. Coyotes would call out from the distance. On these nights, Elijah felt tethered to the world, safe, certain. But in the days leading up to everything that followed, the air began to change. The silence that greeted him each morning became heavier, as though the land held its breath, not out of peace but anticipation. The ground under his feet felt different too, not just dry but taut, stretched by something unseen. Elijah told himself it was nerves, stress piling into unease, but the feeling lingered like a warning he couldn't shake. One morning he noticed that the wind failed to rise as it usually did. The trees at the edge of his land stood eerily still, like they were afraid to move. The birds, which normally announced the sunrise with assertive cries, remained hidden and mute. The familiar noises that made the farm feel lived in were suddenly absent. Even his old dog, Harper, paused and stared toward the fields, ears pricked and body tense. Elijah laid a calming hand on the dog's back, though he felt just as unsettled. As he walked toward the fields, shovel in hand, he sensed eyes on him, not human, not animal, simply a presence. He pushed the feeling aside and hardened his expression as though that alone could chase off whatever stirred at the edges of his awareness. The rows of corn stretched before him, thirsty and struggling as always. Elijah knelt to pull a stubborn weed, and in that exact moment, a glint of unnatural green caught the corner of his gaze. It was a brief flash of something too vibrant to belong in his withering field. He stood slowly, dusting dirt from his palms, and turned to look at the anomaly that had called his attention. There, tucked between two failing stalks in a place he had walked 100 times, grew a plant he had never seen. It stood out like a secret too bright to hide, and Elijah felt his heartbeat shift in his chest. Curiosity, wonder, disbelief, they clashed inside him, making his breath shallow. He took a step closer, then another, his boots sinking into soil that suddenly felt softer beneath him. The world narrowed until only that plant existed. Elijah did not yet understand what he was seeing, nor could he guess how this single discovery would devour the life he thought he knew. But something deep within him, older than reason, older perhaps than fear, told him that this moment marked the end of his ordinary days. And though he didn't yet know why, he felt that nothing would ever be the same again. Everything that defined Elijah Brooks, everything that grounded him, everything he believed about the land he loved, would soon be tested in ways beyond imagination. Standing there in the breathless morning, staring at a living impossibility growing from cracked, hopeless earth, he had no way of knowing that the farm he struggled so hard to protect had already begun its transformation. And so had he. He exhaled slowly, unable to tear his eyes from the vibrant green anomaly, trembling slightly, as if alive with its own intention. The dawn around him shimmered strangely, and with a solemn certainty he couldn't explain, Elijah Brooks felt something beneath his boots pulse like a buried heartbeat. The first sign that the ground itself had awakened. The day that changed everything had begun. The strange morning light clung to the edges of the sky as Elijah stood motionless over the plant that had no right to exist. Hours might have passed, or merely seconds. Time thinned, stretched, and lost its shape while he stared at the impossible green before him. He slowly lowered himself to the dry ground, leaning closer without realizing it, as though drawn by a force that was neither physical nor familiar. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that he should step back, cover it again, pretend the world had not just shifted beneath him. Yet another instinct, older and rooted in the marrow of his bones, told him to stay, to understand. His father used to say that the land always showed signs before it changed, and Elijah wondered whether this was the ultimate sign or a warning of the kind humankind rarely survived. The leaves of the plant were thick, almost fleshy, unlike the skinny, pallid vegetables struggling nearby. They shimmered faintly, as if light sprang from within, rather than reflected off the sun's early rays. Small veins ran across the surface of each leaf, but instead of lying still, they seemed to pulse rhythmically. Elijah blinked, thinking his eyes deceived him, but the movement continued in perfect, slow waves, like the steady beat of a heart. The soil beneath the plant was wet. He reached out cautiously and pressed a fingertip into the ground. Mud clung to his skin. He sniffed the dampness, and a scent rose from it. Cool, fresh, reminiscent of summer mornings long gone. Yet the sky above was clear and dry, the air still starving for rain. There had been no storm, no irrigation, no reason for this pocket of life except that the plant itself demanded it. His pulse thudded in his ears. The rational part of his mind clung to explanations. Maybe a seed had blown in from far away, dropped by a bird that flew over his fields. But no bird could carry something like this. No seed sprouted overnight into a plant more mature than seedlings he'd tended for months. Elijah fought the fear clawing up his spine, but fear won a few inches. He swallowed hard and forced himself to reach toward the nearest leaf. His hand trembled. Just before his fingertips made contact, the leaf twitched and folded inward slightly, as though shrinking from him, or worse, moving toward him in curiosity. Elijah flinched and jerked his hand back. The air around the plant felt different, cooler, heavier, almost tasting of metal. He saw his breath in a faint mist despite the rising heat of the day. He staggered to his feet, trying to compose himself. He reminded himself that the earth was full of surprises. Farmers found oddities in their fields from time to time. But nothing in any story he'd ever heard. No tale from old farmers. No legend whispered in Silver Creek's diner came close to this. His heart hammered in his chest as he backed a few steps away. The plant stood silently, swaying so gently that he could not determine whether the air moved it or the movement came from within. He hesitated only a moment, then turned and hurried back to the house, as though distance alone might restore sanity. Inside, the familiar creak of the screen door and the dusty warmth of his kitchen offered temporary comfort. Elijah splashed water on his face and gripped the sink until his knuckles whitened. He wanted to believe he was still dreaming, but a dream didn't leave mud drying under a fingernail or the faint smell of fresh rain in a drought-stricken field. He reached for his phone once, just a reflex, but froze before touching it. Who would he call? What would he say? "Hello, something unnatural is growing on my land." They would laugh at him, or worse, they would come. They would take the plant, take his land, take the last threads of his life that still felt within his control. He paced the kitchen, back and forth, boots tapping in uneven rhythm against the wooden boards. Harper watched him from his spot near the door, ears twitching, eyes alert. Even the dog sensed there was something foreign and unsettling happening on the farm. Elijah crouched beside him, running his hand along Harper's back. The dog leaned into the touch, drawing comfort, yet offering it too. "It's all right," Elijah whispered under his breath. Not to calm the dog, but to steady himself. Only it wasn't all right. It was profoundly, deeply wrong. And yet, in a way Elijah couldn't explain, it felt miraculous. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. He forced himself to perform his chores, feeding the livestock and checking the fences, but every step he took seemed predetermined to lead him back toward the field. His gaze kept drifting to the horizon line where the plant was hidden beneath its makeshift cover. The air seemed to vibrate faintly with each passing hour. He tried to ignore it, but unease weighed heavily on him like soaked clothes he could not peel away. By midday, his restraint collapsed. He returned to the spot and lifted the covering very slowly, as though unveiling something sacred or dangerous, or both. The plant stood a little taller than before. He stared at it, breath shallow again. If he didn't know every inch of this land, he might have doubted that change had occurred, but it had. He knew it had. The circle of moist soil seemed slightly wider too. The blades of grass he remembered dry nearby now leaned in toward the plant as if nourished by its proximity. Elijah stared, asking himself whether his memory betrayed him, but deep down he knew better. The sun climbed high overhead, though warmth seemed to shy away from that green anomaly. Elijah felt a cool breeze swirl gently around him, impossible in a still landscape. It brushed his hair, whispered through the fabric of his shirt, and then vanished as abruptly as it arrived. He felt the faintest tremor under his boots. He dropped to a crouch and pressed his palm to the earth. A slow, gentle throb pulsed beneath. He recoiled slightly, heart stumbling at the realization. The soil itself felt alive. The hours that followed dragged by with unbearable tension. Elijah tried to work, but his attention frayed constantly. His thoughts became loops of fear and wonder. He found himself glancing at his hands, searching for any change, any sign that the plant's presence had begun altering him too. He felt stronger, strangely enough, less tired. His spine bothered him less when he bent to lift hay or carry water buckets. He chalked it up to adrenaline, nerves fraying at the edges of reason. As dusk painted the world in bruised purples and shadows, he once again covered the plant and returned home. He ate dinner mechanically, not tasting a single bite. His fork scraped against the plate, repeating motions his mind no longer registered. Harper lay curled by the door, eyes fixed on Elijah like he expected something to happen and wanted to be ready when it did. The silence pressed in like a suffocating blanket. Elijah had lived alone for years, but this silence felt possessed, almost alert. When night finally fell, his restlessness became impossible to ignore. He lay in bed with sheets tangled around his legs, staring at the ceiling that hovered just a foot above his thoughts, holding back a universe of questions. Then it happened. The sound. Soft, faint, almost tender. A rustling murmur from the direction of the field. No, not rustling. Not quite. The sound held rhythm, and Elijah's skin prickled. It sounded like a whisper. He sat upright, heart beating faster, straining to listen. The sound continued, a delicate swell of something that seemed like language just out of reach. Elijah swung his legs to the floor and pulled his boots back on. Harper lifted his head but did not bark. He watched Elijah stand and take the lantern, a silent companion sensing the invisible storm forming around them. Elijah stepped outside, cautious yet compelled. The air was colder than usual, crisp enough that it stung his throat as he breathed. There was no wind, no movement in the trees, no insects buzzing. Even the stars seemed to watch in breathless anticipation. He walked toward the fields, following the invisible thread pulling him closer. The plant's presence felt stronger in the darkness, as though night nourished whatever energy it possessed. The whispering grew a little louder, still soft but undeniably intentional. Elijah's breath quickened. He scanned the horizon, but the world around him remained empty, silent, reverent. He stopped before the covered shape and hesitated only a second before lifting the fabric again. Underneath, the plant looked almost luminescent in the moonlight, its veins glowing faintly like roots of starlight tangled within. The whispering hushed immediately, as if the plant became aware of being observed. Elijah couldn't decide whether the silence brought relief or dread. He leaned closer, whispering without realizing he had spoken, and for a moment the leaf closest to him fluttered. It wasn't the breeze, there was none. The movement was deliberate, fragile, almost apologetic. Elijah's stomach knotted with fear, yet the fear did not push him away. Instead, it rooted him to the spot, forcing him to witness the truth he could no longer deny. Something new and unfathomable had taken root on his land. Something with a will, or an instinct, or a consciousness he dared not imagine. He lowered the cover gently, as one might tuck in a child, and retreated toward the house. His mind spiraled with questions that collided in chaotic disorder. He tried to pray before sleep, but the familiar words snagged in his throat, replaced by the echo of that alien murmur he couldn't understand. When exhaustion finally overwhelmed him, he fell into a restless sleep filled with vivid flashes of green light and earth shifting like a living thing beneath him. In the morning, the first thing he saw upon stepping outside was Harper staring toward the fields again, ears pinned back. A chill trickled through Elijah's spine, more intense than the night before. He felt watched, not by the plant, but by the land around it. He marched with growing urgency to the field, compelled by duty or dread. He couldn't tell which, and when he lifted the cover again, what he saw made the world tilt once more. The plant had grown, not a little, not barely noticeable. It was now tall enough to reach his waist, and its leaves were wider, some curling softly upward, as if stretching to greet the dawn. The circle of green grass was larger too, lush and bright against the dead soil surrounding it. He knelt wordlessly, placing a shaking hand on the edge of the circle. The grass bent lightly under his fingers, cool and damp. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental. Elijah felt as though he stood on the precipice of something vast and terrifying. His breath trembled, and he forced himself to speak aloud, not as prayer, but to hear a familiar sound in the face of the impossible. "What are you?" But the plant answered only with silence. He realized he had a choice to make. One wrong step could unleash consequences he couldn't predict. One right step might save something precious. Though what, he couldn't yet name. His chest tightened as though the future itself pressed down upon him, urging him forward and warning him back all at once. Elijah covered the plant once more and turned to face his house. In his heart, he carried a fear that would not ease. But beneath that fear, barely flickering yet undeniably real, a strange loyalty had begun to grow. He would watch over this thing, protect it, understand it, for reasons he couldn't grasp but could not ignore. And as he walked toward his home, unaware of the new footprints forming behind him in the dust, yet too focused on his own pounding heartbeat to look back, Elijah Brooks realized that silence was no longer the only thing inhabiting Silver Creek. The days that followed felt as though they belonged to another season entirely, one untouched by the merciless drought tormenting Silver Creek. Elijah woke each morning with the same anxious urgency and found his feet bringing him straight to the circle of covered earth before his mind even caught up. The sun rose earlier now, or seemed to, and he wondered whether time itself bent around the strange pulse of life in his field. Harper padded beside him, silent and alert, tail lowered and fur prickling, with an awareness Elijah envied. Some animals sense storms before clouds gathered. Harper sensed whatever this was. When he lifted the cover on the third day after discovering the plant, his breath caught in his throat. It had grown again, shooting upward with impossible speed. The top leaves brushed his hip, their tips gently curled like fingers stretching after sleep. The soil surrounding it was darker, richer, and a ring of grass now extended nearly 2 feet in every direction, forming a perfect circle of vibrant green. Elijah studied its flawless border, unnerved by the precision. Nature rarely dealt in symmetry this exact. This looked crafted, intentional. He knelt and touched the ground. It was soft beneath his fingertips, slightly cool despite the climbing heat of the morning. The sensation lingered on his skin, like the memory of water. He closed his eyes briefly, willing away the panic clawing at his chest. The logical part of him insisted he was exaggerating or seeing patterns where none existed. But Elijah was not a man prone to fantasy. The land itself had changed, and he could feel it in his bones the same way he could feel an oncoming storm before clouds appeared. As he rose, his joints did not ache as they once did. He noticed that he stood more easily than he had in years. It unsettled him. Hard work left marks on the body that no rest could erase. Yet here he was, lifting crates and tools with greater strength, waking without stiffness, moving with energy that felt borrowed from somewhere far beyond himself. Elijah tried to dismiss the idea that the plant was affecting him, but every day the truth pressed closer, undeniable. Whatever the plant was, it was not merely living, it was giving, or feeding, or changing. The rest of the farm did not share in its blessing. The corn wilted further, the earth cracked deeper, and his rain storage dwindled. The plant stood as a contradiction to the dying world around it, a miracle surrounded by decay. Elijah felt torn between gratitude and fear. He wanted to protect it, yet he also feared what it might become. At night the whispering continued, soft, rhythmic, like words spoken underwater or through a dream. The first time he heard it again, he froze in bed, clutching the sheet against his chest. Each syllable echoed faintly, bleeding into the silence between beats of his heart. He tried to convince himself it was the wind, though the air outside was still and heavy. Harper sat rigid at the foot of the bed, ears perked, watching the window as though expecting something or someone to appear. Elijah pressed his palms over his ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside him. He could not decipher meaning, but the cadence had something like intent. No one could hear that and still believe this was simply a plant. Sleep grew fitful. Dreams came sharp in vivid curling vines, glowing leaves, the ground heaving like a living chest breathing beneath him. He woke breathless, sweating despite the cool air. Every morning when he opened his eyes, the first thing he felt was longing, a pull toward the fields that made him rise before he could question it. It frightened him how quickly that pull replaced hesitation. By the end of the week, he noticed the first sign that others sensed something was happening too. Mrs. Abernathy, his nearest neighbor, stopped by with a basket of day-old bread and a careful look in her eyes. She commented on how well he looked, how restored his vitality seemed. Her gaze lingered on the direction of the fields with thinly veiled curiosity. Elijah forced a laugh, awkward and unconvincing, assuring her he simply had been sleeping better. He didn't believe his own words, and she clearly didn't either. Later in the afternoon, he spotted teenagers riding their bikes along the dirt road near his property. They slowed as they approached, pretending to be interested in the wildflowers that clung to the ditches. One boy jumped off his bike and wandered too close to the fenced border of the field, trying to peer inside. Elijah felt his stomach twist. He approached with a calm stride but a sharp tone. The boys left, muttering but not arguing. He watched them until they were specks on the road. He already despised the possibility that curiosity would turn into rumors, and rumors into danger. Silver Creek fed on gossip like crops fed on sunlight. Elijah understood that if anyone spoke too loudly about odd behavior, questions would rise faster than weeds. He had never been one to lie, but now he found himself dodging questions, deflecting concern. He hated it, but he hated the alternative more. One evening, as the sun bled gold into the horizon, Elijah stood at his window watching the fields. Harper pressed against his leg, whining low in his throat. There was movement near the far edge of the field shadows, shifting unnaturally. Elijah grabbed his lantern and stepped onto the porch. The air felt charged, an electric tension that made his skin tighten. He walked carefully toward the fields, lantern light swinging at his side. His breaths were shallow and he listened for the whispering voice, but tonight the silence roared louder than any sound. He reached the plant and lifted the covering. The leaves glistened faintly, and for a moment all was still. Then he saw it. The soil had been disturbed around the perfect green circle. The ground bore impressions, footprints, human footprints. Not his, not recent either, as the edges had begun to dry and crack. Someone had been here, watching, examining, maybe searching. Elijah's pulse surged. Who would sneak onto his property under night's veil? And what had they intended to do? He dropped the cover and spun in a slow circle, lantern raised. Nothing moved except the fluttering flame. But someone had trespassed. Someone now knew something strange existed here. Elijah had always believed his biggest enemy was nature, the storms, the drought, the unpredictable wildness of growing things. Now he understood far more dangerous threats existed. Human curiosity, human greed, human desperation. He returned to the house with a grit in his teeth, bolted the door, and sat in the dark. His mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. If one person knew, others would soon find out. And when the wrong people learned of a plant that thrived miraculously under drought's hand, they would come. People with power, people who did not ask permission. The next morning, Elijah found something inside his home that nearly sent him to his knees. On his kitchen table, directly where he ate every meal, lay a small clump of wet soil, rich, dark, and unmistakably from the circle around the plant. It rested there like an accusation or a message. Someone had been inside his home while he slept. Someone had walked close enough to watch him breathe. Every hair on his neck rose. He looked at the locked door, at the undisturbed windows, and felt sick. The intruder must have been silent, or he must have been too deeply lost in those strange dreams to wake. Fear dug its claws into him deeper than it ever had when facing drought or hunger or hard seasons. Those threats were known enemies. This was the unknown, creeping silently into the corners of his existence. He stumbled back into a chair, hands trembling. Harper growled softly, staring again toward the fields. They were not alone. Something unseen was stalking the farm, its attention set on the plant, or perhaps on Elijah himself. He tried to focus on the practical tasks of the day, but each chore became a relentless reminder of the danger pressing inward. The fence seemed too flimsy, the locks too weak, the world too open. He found himself glancing over his shoulder constantly. The sun no longer felt warm, it burned him with suspicion. That afternoon, Elijah left the house earlier than usual to climb a ridge overlooking his land. He needed to see anyone approaching. He needed to know where the threat might emerge. He crouched low among the brush, eyes scanning every inch of the fields. He waited. The wind never picked up. The leaves of the sparse trees did not rustle. Hours dragged by until his legs felt stiff and numb. But he stayed. The silence became suffocating, loud enough to make him wonder if the entire world held still for that single patch of alien green. When shadows lengthened and night began to stain the landscape, Elijah descended, defeated by the unbearable tension of seeing nothing, yet feeling everything. He may not have witnessed the intruder, but he knew eyes had been on him. The prickling along his spine had not left for a single heartbeat. Dinner tasted like ash in his mouth. He barely chewed. Harper remained glued to his heel. Elijah forced himself into bed, though sleep mocked him. His mind replayed the footprints, the soil on his table, the shifting shadows in the night. He drifted into a half-conscious state where the boundary between dream and reality blurred dangerously. The whispering returned. Louder this time. Urgent. A chorus of rustled syllables that raised gooseflesh along his arms. He sat up sharply, breath tangled in his throat. The whispering seemed to come from the walls, from the floor, from beneath his very bed. He sprang up and walked toward the window. The moon lit the fields in a pallid glow, and his eyes locked on the covered mound hiding the plant. For the first time, he felt not curiosity or fear, but a terrible recognition. The plant was calling to him. The earth responded to its presence. His body responded to its presence. And whoever had trespassed whatever had come creeping around his farm in the darkness had been drawn by the same call. He returned to bed but did not sleep. He waited for morning, as if daylight might bring clarity or courage or some answer to the sinking dread. But when morning came, it brought only deeper certainty that he had lost control of his own life. He walked to the field again and found the plant expanded further, larger than yesterday, growing stronger with each sunrise. Its leaves reached out like arms yearning for something. The circle of green widened like an eye-opening to behold the world. The land beneath Elijah's feet felt restless, vibrating softly like a slumbering giant stirring. He wished desperately for the peace he once took for granted, the comforting predictability of soil and sun and hard labor. Instead, every breath he took now tasted like change, vast, frightening change. And as he looked at the place where footprints had sunk into his earth, he knew that humans were no longer his greatest fear. Something much more powerful and ancient had decided to awaken in Silver Creek, and it had chosen him. When dawn returned, it did not bring relief. Elijah stepped out into the pale morning light with a heart that would not stop pounding, as if it fought to escape his chest. Harper trotted at his heels, silent yet watchful, every sense attuned to something beyond the visible. The farm that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a stage on which unseen forces gathered behind the curtains, waiting for their moment to enter. The calm of the air no longer soothed him. Instead, it reminded him of the unsettling quiet just before a storm. He made his way up the familiar path toward the ridge that overlooked his land. The dirt was loose beneath his boots, softened unnaturally by the cool moisture radiating from the direction of the plant. He paused at the top of the incline, breath heavy, and crouched behind a rock outcrop. From here, he could see almost the entire property field stretching in tired rows, the house standing alone against the open distance, and at the center of it all, the covered shape hiding the thing that had already begun to consume his thoughts and dreams. The world remained disturbingly still. No distant cars hummed along the highway, no birds chirped from the sparse trees. Elijah waited, scanning the horizon with intent focus, the minutes stretching into hours in suffocating silence. Occasionally, Harper would stiffen, ears perked as though he sensed movement Elijah could not detect. But each time Elijah followed the dog's gaze, he saw nothing unusual, only rock, brush, and the wavering shimmer of heat rising from cracked earth. Yet the feeling did not leave him. He was being watched, not constantly, not with relentless eyes, but with patience like a predator studying prey before striking. By late afternoon, he descended from the ridge, legs stiff from remaining tense for too long. His stomach felt knotted, the weight of uncertainty pressing down harder with each step. As he approached the house, he convinced himself that perhaps someone had been curious, had trespassed out of restless teenage mischief, and the fear gripping him was nothing more than his mind turning shadows into demons. Then he saw the first set of footprints. They trailed along the side of the house, pressed deeply into the dust, circling the building with slow, measured intent. Someone had come again. Someone was not deterred by the locks, by proximity, or even by Elijah's vigilance. His throat went dry. He dropped to one knee, studying the prints. There were at least two sets, one larger, boots with tread marks he could not place, and another with softer, smoother soles, both fresh, both bold in their intrusion. Elijah's chest tightened. He stood quickly, scanning the surrounding fields, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement on the far side of his property. Nothing clear, just the flash of dark clothing slipping behind a low hill. He blinked, and the shape vanished as though swallowed by the land itself. Harper growled low in his throat, confirming what Elijah already suspected. He had not imagined it. Late in the afternoon, when Elijah was repairing a section of fence he suddenly felt was insufficient, the sound of tires crunching gravel pulled his attention to the road. Two figures appeared, walking toward his property with unsettling confidence, as if they belonged here more than he did. They were strangers, one tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and square jaw. The other leaner, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the farm before even reaching Elijah. The taller man offered a nod, more a gesture of dominance than greeting. The leaner one smiled slightly, though his eyes remained cold. Elijah stood his ground, feeling the air tighten around them. They claimed they had heard about something unusual on the property. Their voices sounded practiced, their concern feigned. They didn't bother explaining how they had come by the supposed information. They simply stated they were there to ensure nothing hazardous was developing. Elijah gave nothing away. He neither confirmed nor denied, but their eyes indicated that silence itself was an answer. The taller man's gaze flicked toward the fields as though he could see straight through the ground and into the plant's pulsing glow. They questioned him not out of curiosity, but expectation. They already knew. Their subtly accusatory tone left Elijah shaken long after they walked away. They left toward the hills, not the main road. They hadn't come from town. They had come from somewhere else entirely, from the outskirts, from the wilderness, from wherever whispers of the plant first spread. When night arrived, the farm seemed to brace itself. Elijah sat inside with the lantern burning bright, unable to relax. The night pressed in like a living weight, heavier than darkness should be. He replayed the stranger's words on a loop, analyzing every glance, every sidelong movement, as though searching for clues he had overlooked. His thoughts tangled into a knot of dread. The unknown footsteps returned. Elijah heard them, first soft crunches of gravel, faint disruptions in dust. He rose slowly, not daring to make noise. Harper let out a low growl, muscles tensed, ready to spring. Elijah crept toward the window and peered out into the murky night. Shapes moved between rows of crops. Two figures, familiar silhouettes, the same men. His breath caught as he watched them approach the covered mound around the plant. Their lantern flickered weakly, as if the air itself resisted light near it. The taller man reached down, ready to uncover it. Elijah's instinct screamed. His hand gripped the door handle before he even realized he'd moved. The wind rose suddenly. The quiet night shattered as a harsh gust erupted across the field, tearing up dust and debris. Elijah froze. Harper barked once, sharp and startled. The strangers shielded their eyes, their lanterns swinging wildly. The field's dead plants bent violently as the wind tunneled directly toward the hidden plant and nowhere else. The sound that accompanied it was not whistling but throbbing, a low hum vibrating through the earth. The strangers stumbled back, retreating without hesitation, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the fence line. The wind died instantly. The calm returned as though nothing had happened. Elijah's legs weakened beneath him. He sank onto a chair, pulse racing, and Harper came to lean against him for anchor. This was no coincidence. The wind had risen only when the men approached the plant, as though the land itself had rejected their presence. He tried to tell himself it was only the approaching storm that never came, the kind Silver Creek hadn't seen in years. But he couldn't lie to himself anymore. The plant reacted not to him, not to weather, but to threat. The next morning, the consequences of the encounter arrived early. 3 trucks rolled down the road in formation, raising dust behind them like a warning flag. Elijah stepped outside before they halted, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. Harper stood beside him, teeth bared as a warning. The truck stopped near his house. From the first vehicle stepped the local town administrator, a man Elijah had seen often enough at town meetings. He usually wore a strained smile, but today his expression was all business and veiled greed. Behind him climbed several others, some familiar faces from local enforcement, others unfamiliar, wearing plain dark clothing that marked them as outsiders with hidden authority. The administrator addressed Elijah with forced friendliness, but quickly shifted to thinly doctored threats. He claimed that rumors of something unnatural growing on the property had reached his office, and that for public safety, he must investigate. Permission was not requested but assumed. Elijah refused, calmly at first, but his voice grew sharper, steelier with each passing second. This land was his. He would not be bullied or robbed, the administrator countered, asserting that the town had rights that superseded Elijah's ownership if a hazardous anomaly existed. And then, without waiting for agreement, they marched toward the field. Elijah could do nothing but follow, heart twisting painfully as they approached the protective cover. The strangers from the night before stood farther back among the group, eyes narrowed knowingly. Elijah moved quickly and lifted the cover himself, not out of obedience, but to prevent rough hands from seizing something that did not belong to them. The plant stood fully revealed, tall and impossibly healthy, its leaves glistening with morning dew that should not exist. The crowd recoiled in visceral, instinctive fear, as if confronted by a living embodiment of their nightmares. For a moment, even the administrator faltered, his confidence cracking. They did not understand what they saw, but they wanted to control it anyway. One man stepped forward, reaching out as if to examine it. Before his fingers grazed a leaf, the ground beneath them shivered, a trembling ripple that knocked him off balance. A sudden, fierce wind blasted the circle again, swirling dust and grass into a miniature storm directly around the plant. The men stumbled backward, shielding faces and cursing. A deep rustle echoed from the leaves, a murmur that sounded eerily like a warning. It was alive in ways none of them could comprehend. Fear replaced ambition in their eyes. Even the administrator stepped back cautiously, his earlier arrogance dissolving beneath the pressure of the unknown. Harper barked ferociously beside Elijah, as though the dog understood that any attempt to take the plant would end badly. The crowd murmured, confused by what they had witnessed and frightened to make another move. They exchanged uncertain glances, retreating beyond the fence line. Elijah lowered the fabric over the plant again, hands trembling, heart thrumming with adrenaline and terror. The men argued briefly among themselves before deciding to withdraw and reevaluate. Trucks rumbled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Elijah alone once more with the pulsing life he had sworn to protect. He stood frozen as silence reclaimed the field. Something profound had shifted, no longer only within the soil, but also within him. The plant had reacted to his fear, protected itself and him. Not out of blind instinct, but purpose. He felt a connection, a bond forged beneath the earth in roots and heartbeat. The decision he feared he'd eventually have to make now loomed closer than he was prepared to accept. The plant had chosen him, and now the world beyond Silver Creek wanted it too. Elijah's gaze drifted toward the hills where the strangers had disappeared. He knew they would return with more men, more authority, more force, but he also knew something deeper now, something he could not explain. The plant was not a threat to him. He was a threat to the world if he let anyone else control it. The weight of this truth settled heavily into his bones as he turned his back on the field and walked slowly toward his home. He did not know what he would do next, only that he no longer had the luxury of denial. Forces greater than drought, greater than fear, had begun to move. Elijah Brooks had stepped into a story far bigger than his own, and there was no going back. Even after the trucks disappeared down the dusty road, the tension clung to Elijah's land like a storm cloud refusing to drift. He watched the fading trail of dust until the horizon swallowed it whole, but his pulse did not slow. Every fiber of his being remained alert, gripped by the certainty that this was not the end. It was merely the first strike in a battle he had never imagined fighting. Behind him, Harper whined softly, torn between loyalty to his master's side and the instinctual unease that pulsed from the covered circle in the field. Elijah placed a shaky hand on the dog's head in a futile attempt to steady himself. He forced himself back into the routine of daily tasks, hoping familiarity might calm his nerves. But he moved without conscious direction, his mind drowning beneath the weight of the morning's confrontation. Every scrape of metal against wood, every distant rustle of leaves felt too loud, too threatening. The farm that once thrummed with quiet life now seemed to hold its breath, the stillness stretched so thin it felt ready to snap. As he worked, he replayed every word exchanged with the administrator and the strangers. The vague threat disguised as public safety, the cold curiosity in the outsider's eyes, the fact that none of them had reacted with ordinary confusion or disbelief. They had come prepared, expecting to see something unnatural. They had even known where to go on his land, stepping toward the plant as though drawn by a map they shouldn't possess. The realization churned Elijah's stomach. This wasn't simply local gossip. The secret had traveled farther than he ever could have predicted. The men who arrived first were scouts. Others, with more power and darker intentions, would surely follow. By midday, his body trembled with exhaustion, even as his mind spun onward, sharp and relentless. Restlessness drove him again to the ridge overlooking the property. Standing beneath the unyielding sun, sweat dripping down his spine, Elijah scanned the edges of the land. He searched for movement, for glints of metal from distant binoculars or figures concealed among the hills. The wind was dead, and the birds, what few remained in this desolate summer, had vanished entirely. The world lay eerily still, waiting. When he returned to the house, he found a folded note tucked beneath a rock on his front step. His breath stalled as he crouched to retrieve it. The handwriting inside was precise and unfamiliar. There were only 2 lines. "We will take what does not belong to you. Do not interfere." He stared at the words until they blurred. The threat was no longer implied. It was promised. A cold tremor spread through him. Whoever left the note had approached the house undetected again, confident enough to announce their intention. They no longer saw him as a man whose property they needed permission to enter. They saw him as an obstacle to be removed. Harper barked suddenly, a sharp warning. Elijah's head snapped up. The dog stood rigid, eyes locked on the fields. Elijah followed his gaze and his heart wrenched violently. The cover he had laid over the plant was gone. Not simply blown off or shifted, it was folded neatly on the ground beside it, as though someone had lifted it with care and placed it there intentionally. Elijah sprinted across the field, boots pounding the earth in frantic rhythm. He skidded to a halt before the plant, breath ragged with fear and fury. The plant stood untouched, its leaves dripping with a faint dew despite the dry heat. Yet something was different. The air around it vibrated faintly, like invisible wires thrumming. The grass ringing it had expanded further, lush and impossibly green, as if nourished by the tension itself. He knelt, hands trembling, and pressed his palm against the ground. Beneath the grass, the earth was no longer simply cool. It pulsed beneath his hand like a slow, powerful heartbeat. Elijah jerked his hand back, chest clenching. Whatever had embedded itself in the soil was growing stronger, not just in size but in presence. It was connected to something deeper, something beneath the layers of dust and stone, something ancient, powerful, and awake. As the sun slid lower and shadows stretched long across the fields, Elijah returned home and barricaded himself inside for the night. He sat motionless at the table, the note lying like a curse before him. The hours crawled by, each one draining more hope from his bones. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him toward sleep, but rest remained beyond reach. His dreams, when they came, were fractured and unsettling, chunks of earth splitting open like jaws, roots twisting into shapes resembling bone, and the plant's leaves unfurling into hands that reached for him with desperate hunger. He awoke to darkness, drenched in sweat, his breath shallow. The whispering had returned. At first it sounded like the faint rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, but the night outside was unnervingly still. The whispering grew louder until Elijah could no longer pretend it was noise. It was language soft, foreign, urgent. Its strange cadence seemed to echo beneath his ribs, like it originated not outside the walls but within his own chest. Harper whimpered beside the bed and nudged closer to Elijah, trembling. The whispering suddenly broke into clarity. Elijah. He flinched violently, pulse soaring. He stumbled out of bed, reaching instinctively for the lantern. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. The whispering continued, the sound curling around his name like a plea. Elijah, help. The voice wasn't human and yet, chillingly, undeniably familiar. The cadence felt like the earth itself pleading through a single fragile channel. The sound originated from the field, from the plant. His breath came in short bursts as he opened the door to step into the night. Moonlight washed the farm in pale silver, turning the plant's protective circle into a glowing ring against the darkness. The whispering swelled the moment the door opened, like relief washing from the ground. Harper barked sharply, hackles raised, but Elijah raised a hand to calm him. Something in that whispered plea, even steeped in terror, spoke of trust. The plant did not call anyone else. It called Elijah. Drawn by fear and an overwhelming sense of responsibility he could not explain, he approached the field with desperate caution. Halfway there, he stopped, his breath catching. A figure stood at the edge of the field. Human, motionless, watching. Elijah's lantern light flickered across a broad pair of shoulders and a shadowed face he recognized in an instant. The tall stranger who had come with the administrator. The man stood like a silent sentinel, gaze fixed on the plant with a hunger that made Elijah's skin crawl. Harper lunged forward with a deep snarl, and the stranger turned, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Their eyes locked for the briefest moment, and then the man stepped back, disappearing into darkness without a sound. Harper gave chase, but Elijah called him sharply back. The stranger was gone before the dust even finished stirring. Elijah reached the plant, breathing hard. Its leaves shimmered faintly, swaying though no breeze stirred. The whispering softened, curling into a low thrumming that pressed against his thoughts. "We need you." The meaning wasn't truly words, it was feeling. Elijah gasped, dizzy from contact with something larger than comprehension. The connection he had sensed before now threatened to overwhelm him. The plant was not talking, it was communicating through emotion, through vibration, through life itself. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of sensations, fear, urgency, hope twisting into him like roots coiling around a seed. He braced himself with palms against the earth. The ground vibrated, pulsing more rapidly now, as though reacting to his touch. A distant engine rumbled. Lights flared against the far horizon. The trucks were returning. Elijah lurched to his feet, suddenly cold with the realization that time had run out. His decision was no longer something he could postpone or weigh carefully. If he stayed, the plant would be taken, studied, exploited, maybe destroyed. And with it, the land he loved would be devoured by forces that cared nothing for its history, its promise, or its keeper. He stared at the house he had repaired with his own hands, the barn built by his grandfather, the fields that bore the weight of generations. Each structure held years of sweat, laughter, heartbreak, and quiet triumph. To leave now felt like tearing his own heart from his chest. Yet in the darkness, the plant quivered with desperate trust. He understood then what the whispering aimed to convey. The connection had chosen him, not because of chance, but because of character. The plant sensed his devotion to the land, his quiet perseverance, the goodness that guided every hard day he endured. It trusted him to protect what others would abuse. Harper pressed against his leg, urging him forward. Elijah looked toward the looming trucks, headlights cutting into the night like blades, and he knew with painful clarity that the battle was already lost if he remained. The only way to save the plant and the farm, and perhaps something greater, was to take it far from the reach of anyone who would claim it. As the trucks approached, he knelt, gripped the plant firmly at the base, and pulled with every ounce of strength his body possessed. The earth resisted at first, clutching the roots deep within. But then the ground shuddered beneath him, a jolt like a heartbeat, and the soil loosened, releasing the plant into his arms. He stood, breath shaking, with the strange weight cradled carefully against his chest. The plant's glow intensified, leaves curling inward as if for protection. The soil around its uprooted form remained damp and vibrant, as though it carried its own pocket of life-supporting earth with it. The trucks roared closer, lights nearing the house. Elijah turned toward the ridge, toward the hills beyond, toward escape. His boots found strength and purpose, striking the earth in powerful strides. Harper stayed close, sprinting ahead to clear the path. Elijah did not look back, not at the house, not at the barn, not at the life he had built through years of relentless labor. If he did, he feared he would collapse beneath the weight of loss. He climbed, breath tearing from his lungs, heart hammering with the fear of what chased him and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The plant in his arms seemed to pulse with encouragement, with gratitude, with something like hope. At the top of the ridge, Elijah paused for just a second. Silver Creek stretched silently below, the town unaware of the war unfolding at its edges. He realized this journey was no mere escape. It was an exile he accepted willingly. He was not running from danger. He was leading danger away from everything he loved. His life had changed the day he discovered something impossible growing from barren soil. Now it changed again as he stepped into the unknown, carrying a force that could reshape the world. With one final look at the farm he vowed to protect, even in absence, Elijah Brooks turned away from everything familiar and disappeared into the darkness, guided by the soft, unwavering glow nestled safely against his heart. Night clung to the mountainside as Elijah climbed higher, each step a battle between exhaustion and urgency. His breath tore through the silence in ragged bursts, and the plant's weight in his arms grew heavier with every stride. Yet he refused to loosen his grip. Harper ranged ahead, a silent shadow guiding them along the faint trail that wound into the wild highlands. The glow emitted from between the leaves flickered occasionally, dimming then brightening again, illuminating the darkness just enough that Elijah never lost sight of the next foothold. Behind him, the engines of pursuit roared like metallic thunder, searching the land below, headlights sweeping across the fields where he once felt safe. Every time the beam swept too close, his heart slammed hard against his ribs, urging him faster. Above him, the sky stretched vast and starless, thick with clouds that threatened rain, yet withheld mercy. The air grew cooler and more humid as they ascended. Harper stopped once, ears pointed back, listening. Elijah froze as well, holding his breath. The rumble of vehicles was distant now. No voices, no snapping branches that might signal a chase on foot. For the moment, the darkness sheltered them. Yet Elijah did not let relief slow him. He pressed on until the noise below faded into the night's heavy breathing. Only then did he allow himself to pause beneath a cluster of tall pines, leaning against the rough bark while trying not to collapse. Sweat drenched him despite the cold. His legs trembled. His arms ached. He slowly lowered the plant to the ground and knelt beside it. Harper sat close, leaning into Elijah's side as though sharing strength and fear alike. The plant seemed smaller for a moment, leaves curled inward protectively, but as Elijah watched, its glow steadied, casting gentle light over the roots still wrapped in clinging soil. The hum of communication he had grown painfully accustomed to pulsed through his bones. It wasn't words yet, not clearly, but Elijah understood the message. Gratitude and warning intertwined. He looked back toward his farm, though darkness masked it entirely from view. The familiar places, the porch where he sat at sunset, the barn built by his grandfather, the fields that bore his family's story were now far behind him, as unreachable as a memory of another lifetime. Harper nudged him with a soft whine, reminding him that the world had not stopped simply because his had been uprooted. He rose slowly and gathered the plant into his arms again. His boots scraped over loose rock as the trail narrowed and twisted upward. The wind began to moan through the rocks, carrying with it a voice-like tremor that made Elijah's skin tighten. He wasn't sure if it was merely wind or something else entirely, the land reacting to the presence he now carried. Hours passed. The night deepened to its coldest, darkest point, when time itself seemed to stop. Elijah shivered, but the plant's warmth seeped through his shirt, comforting him in a way that felt unsettlingly alive. He stumbled once, nearly falling, but Harper's bark snapped him back to focus. There was no room for weakness here, not now. Finally, the incline leveled. Elijah emerged upon a wide shelf of land, overlooking an endless expanse of rolling hills. From this vantage point, the entire valley lay cloaked in shadows. A distant flash of headlights flickered briefly, but then vanished beneath the terrain, too far now to pose an immediate threat. For the first time that night, Elijah inhaled without feeling his breath might shatter. He set the plant down at the center of the plateau. The soil here was rocky, unforgiving, but the plant's energy radiated outward, moisture condensing on the stones around it like morning dew. Elijah knelt beside it, placing both hands on the ground. Beneath his palms, the earth felt alive, trembling ever so slightly, as though recognizing the presence of something powerful and ancient. A memory flickered through his thoughts. His father's voice, rough with years of toil, saying that the land was a living thing. It needed care, trust, and a protector unafraid to listen. Elijah had always believed him, but the belief had been practical, rooted in tradition. Now confronted with the literal heartbeat of the ground beneath him, he realized the truth was far greater than he had imagined. The whispering returned this time clearer, closer to language he could almost understand. His name echoed through it like a thread anchoring him to the moment. Elijah, you are chosen. The words filled his mind, vibrating through marrow and muscle. He staggered, eyes wide, heart thundering as he tried to comprehend a fate he had never sought. Chosen for what? Protector, witness, sacrifice. The plant's glow intensified, leaves unfolding slowly like wings stretching after confinement. Its stems straightened, taller than before. The circle of life around it expanded, grass sprouting, thriving in mere seconds where nothing had grown for years. Elijah was mesmerized and terrified in equal measure. Harper barked once, uncertain whether to defend or flee. Elijah placed a steadying hand on the dog's head, afraid that if they both panicked, the bond he felt, this fragile, inexplicable connection, might fracture. He whispered, voice cracked and trembling, "What do you want from me?" The air thickened. A low, resonant hum pulsed through the plateau, rattling small stones and filling Elijah's chest with warmth and ache. The meaning that pressed against his mind was painful in its clarity. They will take. We will lose. You protect. Simple. Devastating. Elijah looked out over the valley. He saw the trucks again, crawling through the dark like predators that refused to give up the hunt. They would not stop. They would search every acre, scour every ridge until they found what they wanted. And then they would drag it back to whatever facility waited white walls, metal restraints, fluorescent lights, and force answers out of something that was not theirs to understand. He pictured a sterile room filled with cold instruments tearing through verdant flesh, and something inside him boiled. "No," Elijah whispered, voice low but burning. The plant responded immediately, its glow spreading outward in a protective aura. The plateau's air seemed to pulse with determination, with the promise of resistance. The connection between them solidified, his resolve feeding its strength, its presence fortifying his spirit. As moonlight seeped through a crack in the clouds, Elijah knelt beside the plant once more. He pressed his forehead to its leaves, a gesture so instinctive he didn't understand it until after it happened. For a moment he felt himself rooted in the ground, as though the earth beneath him recognized him too, claiming him as one of its own. A memory surfaced suddenly. The first time Elijah had held a dying seedling, his father's hand guiding his, telling him that everything alive fought to stay that way. He understood now that this plant was more than a miracle. It was a survivor, a life meant for a place where its power wouldn't be twisted by human greed. The hum around them softened, shifting into a gentle, comforting rhythm. Harper lay down beside Elijah, curling against his leg, trusting his decision entirely. The chase below quieted. The trucks had stopped moving. They were searching, but they were lost in the maze of the hills. For the first time since the nightmare began, Elijah allowed himself to breathe deeply. His chest still ached with fear and grief, but beneath those sharp pains was a deeper sensation, purpose. He did not choose this fate, but he accepted it. He was responsible, not only for the farm left behind, but for this impossible life now entrusted to him. He stayed there until the earliest hint of sunrise brushed the horizon. Soft bands of pink and amber stretched across the sky like a silent promise. The plant glowed brighter in response, reflecting dawn's colors with breathtaking brilliance. It seemed to reach upward, greeting the new day with hope Elijah had nearly forgotten existed. He rose slowly, filled with both sorrow and strength. Behind him, far away in the valley, his home would soon wake without him. People would gather, search, speculate, perhaps even mourn. His absence would be noticed, but he would not allow guilt to turn him back. To return would mean sacrifice of the plant and eventually the land itself. He looked to the hills ahead, steep and wild, untouched by boundary or law terrain that would hide them for as long as needed. He cradled the plant again, lifting with careful arms honed by years of work. The earth beneath him vibrated softly, carrying silent encouragement. Harper trotted ahead once more, tail raised, ready to follow wherever Elijah led. And Elijah, though his heart remained heavy with goodbyes unsaid, stepped forward with quiet courage. He would keep moving. He would protect the life that had chosen him. He walked into the rising light, each step guided by the soft pulse against his chest and the certainty growing inside him, a certainty rooted deeper than fear. Sometimes the greatest calling does not wait for the willing. It chooses the worthy. And as Elijah Brooks disappeared into the mountains with a living miracle in his arms, he carried with him the hope that even the smallest act of protection could change the fate of a world that had forgotten how to listen to the land that once sustained it. If this story kept you hooked, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Turn on notifications and be the first to see our new videos. The next one is already on the way. Share this video with someone who loves mysterious discoveries and unbelievable twists, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Stay with us. The most shocking stories are still ahead.